All right, so we got through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we did last week. So moving along, continuing on in the patriarchs, we've got one last major patriarch. I mean, usually it's just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but Joseph is he's a pretty big character in the Bible. I mean, there's a lot. I'm sure everyone's pretty familiar with the stories of Joseph, and we've seen the movies, and Prince of Egypt, and it's probably one of the most well-known parts of the Bible. So kind of similar to the last few that we've done, just be kind of hitting the high points and kind of an overview, not trying to get anchored too far down in Joseph's life, because there's just so many messages and applications that you can get out of Joseph's life. He went through so much and was so victorious and had a good life of faith that there's just so many examples that you can use. And as far as the way the events and stuff are going, we're cruising along through the Old Testament pretty quick. If you look at our timeline here, we started laser pointer. We covered the creation and Adam and Eve and the fall and the wickedness of man and the flood that God brought to destroy the wickedness of man, and the ark. And you remember what the ark was a picture of? Salvation. How many arks are there in the Bible? Three. What are the other two?
Moses' ark.
Yeah.
The Ark of the Covenant.
And the Ark of the Covenant. So, really, just little trivia. Remember, what those all pictured? So, what was in the Ark of the Covenant? Yeah, the law was in there, and obviously, Aaron's rod. There was some manna, but primarily the Ten Commandments were in there, and obviously Moses was inside the Ark of Bulrushes. So you had the Ark, Noah's Ark, which saved them from the wrath of God being poured out. You had Moses' Ark of Bulrushes, who it saved him from Pharaoh's wrath, and Pharaoh is a picture of who? Picture of Satan. Yeah, so Pharaoh's a picture of Satan. So you had that ark protecting God's people from Satan's attacks, and the Ark of the Covenant had the law, which provided a separation and protection from the law of God, the condemnation of the law. So you take those three arks together, and you have God's people protected from God's wrath, from the attacks of Satan, and from the condemnation of the law. So just kind of neat pictures as we're going through and trying to take out pictures and typology in the scriptures. So after the flood, we had the Tower of Babel, and then Abraham came along. And it was a kind of God's way of fighting back against all the polytheism and paganism that was spreading after Babel and Nimrod, and just all the idolatry and paganism. So he called Abraham and made a covenant with him that he would bless him and make him a great nation, and the whole world would be blessed through him. And now we're dealing with the patriarchs from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and tonight Joseph. But if you look, here's the end of the Old Testament when we get to the cross right here. So we're more than halfway through the Old Testament. So you think about it that way, we're making some good progress. We've covered, 2,000 years more of, over 2,000 years of human history so far. So sometimes you think of the Old Testament just being this big, huge, difficult to understand thing, but yet when you really just break it down into chunks, the creation, the fall, the flood, the patriarchs, you can kind of see it, how it all fits together more, and get a better overview of it and understand it better. And I'm getting behind on my clicks already. So we started there and we went there. Should have done this while I was talking. Wasted my animation. So we're talking about Joseph. And if you remember, the Abraham I labeled as the father of the Hebrew people, because he was really the first person that God called out from the Gentile world and to make a people for himself. And then Isaac was the father of the promise, because he pictured very clearly and amazingly the relationship that we, the church, have with Christ, with Rebecca being a picture of the church, and being united with Isaac, being taken out of a Gentile nation and brought to her husband, the way that we're looking forward for us to be caught up and taken to heaven to be with Jesus. And then Jacob, who was the father of the nation of Israel, where Abraham is like the father of all the Hebrew people, where Jacob with his 12 sons really, got the whole thing going with the tribes and getting the numbers increasing. So I just figured we'd call him the father of the nation of Israel. And Joseph really, if you want to kind of sum it up, he really, his life is known by his success in Egypt. He became the leader of one of the most, or the most powerful nation that existed in the time. So we're going to kind of look at his rise from his humble beginnings to his being the second most powerful man on the face of the earth. This section of Genesis, when you come to like manuscript evidence, they didn't find like just one huge book written of Exodus. They have like a bunch of fragments and chunks that were written at different times, and this is like the last whole section that contains the story of Joseph through his time in Egypt to the time when he dies in Egypt and Genesis ends. So it's all like one chunk, and it's the last chunk of Genesis. So Joseph was born in Haran. Jacob was about 90 years old. So isn't it kind of neat? You get your mind, where's Haran? Oh, it's up there, right where the Tigris and Euphrates kind of go apart up there. So he was born, Jacob was 90. And then you remember Jacob then left Haran and after his struggles with Laban, and went back to Canaan. And on his way, he met Esau and they had that whole reunion. But he went on his way to Canaan, and that was Joseph was probably about 7 years old when he actually got back into the land of Canaan. And he's just an amazing character to look at, because he's really one of the most pure Old Testament characters like in the Bible. He just, there's nothing said bad about him. Where the Bible's so honest about so many other characters, their positive traits and their failures, yet Joseph just perseveres and hangs on to his faith and has a good testimony all through, and truly like one of the purest characters that we see in the Scripture. And as you might guess, as we're looking for pictures and types, who might he be a type of? Jesus or Christ. Just he's got so much character and purity. Just makes sense that he could be a type of Christ. So let's keep our minds open as we read through it or talk about it and see if we can find some pictures. He also had a strong sense of leadership. He was a natural born leader, and everybody that he dealt with knew that and took advantage of that in a good way. Even from his time that he was young and still at home with his father, his father would send him out to check up on his older brothers, who were significantly older than him. Joseph was born when Isaac was he was old. He was 90 years, Jacob was 90 years old when Joseph was born. So those 12 or 11 brothers of his except for Benjamin, were significantly older than him, and yet he was the one that his father turned to kind of hold them accountable and make sure that they were keeping the sheep and doing what they needed to do. So natural leadership. And then, going on and, without getting into the whole story, when he gets sold into Egypt and he's working in Potiphar's house, his leadership is acknowledged. And when he meets Pharaoh, just a natural, strong leader. And he's an example to us because this is truly a character that makes the best of every unpleasant situation. If you're feeling like life has got you down, or you're in a hard place, or your job's got you down, or relationships or family are a trial, you just need to look at Joseph's life, because he just kept going and persevered, and he had it all. He had family problems and social problems and job problems and prison, he had it all against him, but yet he held on to his faith and trusted God, and God worked it all out for good. And we'll kind of see as we go through this a little bit, we see the Bible story, so we see his whole life summed up in an hour and a half movie, and it seems like everything progresses like pretty quick. It's like, okay, he's with his brothers, and then they sell him, and then like a few weeks later, he's working for Potiphar, and then that doesn't work out, and he gets tossed in prison, and then like, a month later, he's like with Pharaoh. It all in our brains, with the way we're raised with the Bible stories, we don't see that this happened over the course of his life, that he spent large amounts of time in those situations, and rather than getting discouraged, he held on to his faith and just kept true to God and trusted that God would work it all together for good, and ultimately God did. And he kept his childhood faith. He never wavered. From the time he was young, he had visions from God. He was right with God from the time he was young, and all through, as different people interacted with him, he kept his godly testimony. He held on to a righteous life, and all through until his old age, nothing bad is said about him where he struggled with his faith. And he was also good looking. It says that he was well favored. So he had it all. He had godliness and faith and leadership, and I guess maybe leadership and good looks can go along together a little bit, but he had the blessing of being a handsome man on top of it all. So a little bit about the setting, like where he came from and his background. And I was kind of thinking, about why the Jews end up having to go into Egypt and all that, and just kind of, if you look at the setting a little bit, is the family life and the stuff going on around the time of Joseph. It's like a soap opera. It's like I don't know who, like the Kardashians or whatever. It's like if you just were to watch the different family members of Jacob's family, there's just like scandal after scandal after scandal. There was Dinah and Shechem. If you remember, Dinah was Jacob's one daughter who went out to see the daughters of the land. Insert whole message here about that, but we'll pass on that. But she hooked up in a bad relationship that wasn't approved, and just caused a whole bunch of problems there, which actually led to a mass murder because her brothers got so mad that they went to the city of the Hivites and literally slaughtered like all the men of the city who knew about that or that were related to the guy that had taken advantage of Dinah. There was who the Bible just says he was wicked, and God killed him. End of And then there's Onan, who we're not even going to talk about. He ended up having problems.
Oh yeah.
Judah, Judah, one of the brothers, Judah in the line of Christ, he ended up, hiring his daughter-in-law as a prostitute. So, the whole family has, issues. And then we have attempted fratricide. We have, actual brothers who want to literally, they literally want to kill their own flesh and blood.
Judah, what are you doing? You're scaring me. Stop it! There's no need to be annoyed. We just want to try out the other club. Come here! No! Judah! Anyone want to try his new coat?
Who was the one that stood up for him again? Was it Judah or who was
The
the
oldest, right?
Simeon? No, it wasn't Simeon.
You mean the ones that helped him?
The one that stood up for him and said
Well, there was two. I think it was Simeon. Well, I got it in the notes in a little bit, but I think it was Simeon who was let's not just kill him, let's just throw him in the pit. But then Judah was actually planning on, he's the one that talked them into selling him. So he did have two brothers that kind of stood up for him. But if you were to read this in the news, like I said, if this was a leading family in the nation, and you just saw this in the tabloids, every month or whatever, I mean, he'd be like, wow, who are these people? I mean, they're just, there's issues going on. So going back into his home life a little bit, he was the most loved of the sons. Isaac loved him more than all the other sons, and it says because he was the son of his old age. And it's kind of funny because sometimes we'll actually joke, and she'll be like, well, what would happen if I got pregnant now? And it's like, well, it would be really interesting. I mean, because life would certainly be different. When we're younger and we have a bunch of kids and we're busy and we're not as set financially and trying to make ends meet. But then when you're older and you think that's all done, if you were to get all of a sudden a little baby, I don't know, it'd be it'd probably be kind of spoiled.
Isn't that supposed to be Jacob?
Yeah, typo. Sorry.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Joseph.
I'm thinking maybe
Yeah, it was Isaac and then Jacob.
Jacob.
Yeah,
Jacob.
typo.
Or Joseph.
Insert Jacob
Jacob.
here. Yeah.
Okay.
But and that's kind of interesting too, because it's the opposite than that what Jacob had. Because remember, Isaac loved Esau, and Jacob actually didn't get the love of a father, but yet he turns around and he actually chooses one of his own sons and lavishes his love on one particular son, and it was because he was the son of his old age. That Jacob was, what did I say, 90 years old when he was born. So Jacob really showed him a lot of affection, but that led to his brothers being very jealous and hating him, just literally hating. And just an example, jealousy can ruin a family. Any family, if jealous feelings and envy, it's just it's a canker that'll just eat away and destroy even the best families. And as I mentioned, that he had a prophetic dream. God gave him a couple prophetic dreams. He had a dream where a bunch of sheaves were all bowing down to him, which pictured his brethren. And then he had a second dream where the sun and the moon and 11 stars were all paying obeisance to him. And we kind of looked at that in comparison, I think a while back, to Revelation 12. That Revelation 12 sign matches up pretty close with this dream that he had with the sun and the moon and the 12 stars, because now it includes Jacob as the 12 tribes, the crown of 12 stars over this woman. And the sign only happened once in all the 7,000 years of human history that we know of. This has only happened once, and it just happened a few years ago in 2017. What does it mean? Could mean something. Could mean the time is getting close. Can't get my laser out of there. Go away. Turn it off. All right. So he had a prophetic dream, and had the sun, the moon, the stars, and the sheaves all bowing to him, and he went and told his family about it, which may not have been the best idea. I mean, if you're at odds with your brothers and sisters or friends, whoever, if your relationship is really suffering, it may not have been the smartest thing to do to go to all of them and say, you know what, guys, I had this dream, and and say it in code, but it's obvious what you're talking about, that, I had 11 sheaves bowing down to me, my 11 brothers, maybe it might not have been the best idea. Maybe he could have discussed it with his father, or I don't know.
Maybe he was just that innocent.
Yeah, just, they're going to be so happy, they're going to love me because I had a dream from God. Yeah, you never know. Could be. But, I mean, even Jesus tells us that we're not to cast our pearls before swine. Even if you have something good, something valuable, use some discernment. Don't just throw it out there for everybody, especially if there's people that are going to be real antagonistic towards you, or even get more violent or angry towards you, which is exactly what happened with Joseph's brothers.
And sometimes people who are really confident need to be humbled.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, sometimes it's just sometimes it's better to hold your tongue, or to just share something with, maybe one person or two, or close friends, and then just wait for a time. And if the Lord leads you to share it with other people, maybe it would be better shared at a different time. But ultimately, God worked it together for good, and we see later on in Joseph's life when he is a ruler in Egypt that his dreams are fulfilled prophetically because his family does come and they're all bowing before him. But then we see the telescope down the road, 7,000 and once in 7,000 years, that Revelation 12 sign. So after his brother is getting so upset and angry and jealous, they decide to kill him. His own flesh and blood, literally schemed. They wanted to kill him, to make him die. They had a whole plan. They thought it out. It wasn't just a spur of the moment act of passion where he just did something that made them so mad. They planned it out. They're like, okay, we're going to kill him. We're going to take his coat. We're going to dip it in the blood of an animal and take it back to our father. And we're going to say an animal killed him. So it was very premeditated. It was thought out. It wasn't just a crime of passion that came along. And it was Reuben. Reuben was the one. Yeah. He was the one who says, let it.
I looked it up because it was bugging me.
Yeah. And let not his blood, our flesh and blood, let not his blood be upon us. And so we convinced them to just throw him in the pit, thinking that he would sneak back later and help him to escape out of the pit and send him on his way. And then Judah, move along here. Yeah, they threw him in the pit. And then ultimately Judah convinced them to sell Joseph, because he must have known that the hatred, the animosity, and all those brothers was so strong that even if he delivered him out of the pit, if he came back home, his life probably would have been in danger at another point. So he thought maybe we can just get him out of the picture. Here we'll sell him to these Ishmaelites that are coming through. And then those Ishmaelites ended up selling him to Potiphar, who just happened to be the captain of Egypt's guard. So pretty powerful fella that Joseph ended up working for. And through it all, you never hear Joseph complain. He never is like, oh, woe is me. Even when you read in the Psalms, so many times David's like, oh, Lord, they're just increased against me, and there's arrows pointing at me all over the place, and I just can't get ahead. But you don't see any of that with Joseph. He just keeps his faith, he keeps moving forward, and he makes the best of wherever he's at. Whether he's still at home working for his father, or he's working for Potiphar, or if he's thrown in prison or working under Pharaoh, every step of his life, he's literally just doing the best he can. And that's that's what we should be doing. Whether we're at a job that we're not sure we're going to stay at forever, or our home life and relationships. It's like wherever we're at, we just need to make the best of it instead of complaining. And like I said a week or two ago, I don't want to be like the Israelites who came out of Egypt, and the second some little bit of tribulation came along, instead of going to God and saying, hey, we're kind of thirsty here, or we're kind of hungry, can you give us some food? Oh, I wish we were back in Egypt. We should just have died in Egypt. Why should we come out here? I don't want to be a complainer and forget all the things that God has done for me. So let's look to Joseph as an example. Even if you're in the pit or in prison. Sometimes I feel like my job's a prison. You got to go there. It takes up so much of your time. But yet, if you're doing the best that you can and you're glorifying God, God can turn that and turn it around and work it out for good wherever you're at.
Amen.
Amen. Oh, and after they, just a quick note here, when they threw him in the pit and they took his coat, it proves that the clothes didn't make the man. So many times we gotta dress nice and the clothes make the man. They took the clothes, but he kept his character. Even after he was thrown in the pit, lost his coat that he loved, he still continued on doing his best for God. He still was diligent and productive. So he ends up in Egypt, in Potiphar's home, as I mentioned, captain of Egypt's guard, high position, and again, making the best of it, trusting God, not complaining, not despairing, not woe is me, but putting his, the hand to the grindstone, or just doing the best he can, working hard. He could have been looking, if I was Joseph, I think I'd be looking for a chance to escape. I'd be like, at the first chance I get, I want to get out of here. Why would I want to just be a servant, in somebody's house, essentially a slave that was bought and, sold and bought. I'd be looking to get out of there. But instead, he literally just stayed in that situation and did the best that he can and was greatly blessed for it. And here's like one of those chunks of time. He was in Potiphar's house for maybe 10 years. When we think about it in the stories, you just kind of, the movie moves along kind of quick. But I mean, that was a good chunk of his life. I mean, you'd think that after, a year, 2 years, I mean, I'd be getting a little discouraged, God, what's up with this? I've been, a servant here. But he just sticks it out, is faithful, and God ends up blessing him. Even after 10 years, he doesn't get discouraged. And he remains faithful to righteousness. He resists the temptation. So by now, he's been in the house for maybe 10 years. He's probably in his mid-20s now. He's a young man, and he demonstrates that it's more important to do right and be honorable. And he literally flees from this temptation where, here we got Potiphar's wife coming after him, and there's a lot of different stories and applications. I mean, it seems like you could be careful about the situation. I mean, he knows that this woman's been after him, and yet he goes into the house alone where there's no other people around. Again, you could almost learn a little bit, like use some discernment. If there's like a situation that could be troublesome, bring somebody with you, or it's just better to talk to someone about it, or just avoid it altogether. And just another side note, in all the stories we hear, isn't this pictured as like some great temptation for Joseph? Right? Isn't it like she came after him, and like just this, this beautiful woman was, this temptation, and he was strong and he resisted and he fled the temptation. Well, I mean, being the literalist that I like to be with Scripture, it doesn't say that she was attractive. It doesn't say that he was tempted. I mean, for all we know, she could have been ugly. I mean, we don't know. But he fled the scene. But it doesn't say that he was being tempted. He could have been sick of it. He could have like been really annoyed by her, for all we know. But just to keep it in balance, because we get our Bible story pictures of the Bible, but then let's just try to stick as close as we can to the Scriptures. It doesn't say that he was tempted, but it's a very good example for us to just flee bad situations.
You would, wouldn't you? It would be easy to assume, though, that
it would be,
because we're talking about the most powerful
guy. He's a young man, and obviously, and it most likely probably was, but
you would hope that,
but yet,
the Potiphar would have a decent looking wife,
Yeah.
But I think she was the one who was tempted with him.
Well, yeah, she definitely
wanted to have him, and he rejected her several times.
Yeah.
Before, if you read it.
Yeah, there was multiple times.
So he refused her, and that made her mad, because there's this young, good-looking guy refusing this prestigious woman.
Right.
I personally don't, I mean, who knows, but I don't feel like he was tempted with her.
It was probably also an insult.
There could have been a ton of girls around there that were gorgeous.
Right.
Well, he was like a servant, so like even refusing something.
Right.
From
even
that's
even
like your boss,
if she was ugly, it was like not his place. So that was like the main thing. Was like, no, like you're not. That's not. I'm not here. Like it's not my place to. Because he was like, right, because he was still a servant at that time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, servants probably weren't used to saying no, or they probably weren't used to a servant saying no.
But he was
Right.
he was a servant, but he was very like high ranking as a servant. I mean, he had control of everything. Like Potiphar didn't even know what he owned. Like Joseph he took care of all the finances. He took care of the flocks, the herds. He like managed it all. And it says that Potiphar didn't even know like what was under his hand.
And what if
like,
his wife actually was scheming and thought, if I get with this guy's going somewhere. Maybe I can get him under, my control, and if her
possibly, because
she doesn't have a good relationship with him or whatever, she's gonna get this next young guy who's moving up the ladder.
And Scripture does say like God blessed Potiphar's entire household, like for Joseph's sake. So like everything Joseph did prospered and was blessed, and maybe she saw that. You know, and that's almost something, I mean, we kind of deal with this in the world as Christians. It's like if you have something that is different and respectable and godliness, it's almost a challenge for people. Almost, I mean, even before I was a Christian, I had some decent morals, and like I didn't, even like as a teenager, I just didn't swear. I don't know, I just had no interest in it. And I literally would be with like a friend who would be like, why don't you swear? Come on, I just want to hear you say a swear word. It's like the world doesn't like seeing something that's like a better standard than them. They want to bring you down to their level. So, you know, maybe there's something there too. Maybe there's a supernatural involved, you know, if Satan's there and, you know, knows some of what God's plan is, knows that this man is like the next of the line of patriarchs for the promise to come through. I mean, imagine what would have happened if he would have gave in and sinned with her. I mean, it could have just changed the entire story.
It would have been killed.
Could have been.
Probably.
Could have been. Although I kind of have the thought that, you know, after he resisted her, he was slandered. She said that he attempted to attack her, and he gets thrown in prison, where he's in prison for at least 2 years. I've heard it theorized that Potiphar must have known the truth, because if any man like legitimately tried to attack the wife of the captain of the guard of Egypt, like he would have executed him on the spot. Like there's no way he would have just thrown him into prison. And then like, I mean, as any normal man, if you really were dealing with somebody that you thought was trying to attack your wife, and then like you saw him in prison like a year later and he's running the joint, you'd be like, what's going on here? This isn't you know, some white collar prison where they've got cable TV. This guy should be killed. But Potiphar didn't, you know, think about it. He actually just sent him into prison instead of killing him. I mean, if Potiphar really believed he was guilty, probably would have just stuck him right there and, you know, no questions asked.
Yeah, that's a good point. I feel like he probably did, because he probably knew who his wife was even. Probably saw the way he looked and she looked at him, and
yeah, I'm sure
was like, all right, I'll throw him into prison.
Yeah,
Like,
like,
it may not have been the first time, you know.
Yeah.
something like that
Yeah,
happened.
really.
you know, and then and Joseph, I mean, even after that, I mean, Joseph, like you'd think he would have fled, right? I mean, if it was me and I just got slandered, like with that accusation against the captain of the guard, I mean, you think you'd be like hitting the road like as fast as you can, like let's go find those Ishmaelites again and, you know, get another job somewhere. But like he actually hung around and like got caught. You know, he was still faithful, trusted God, and just went along for the ride and made the best of it.
I know in the movie, the Potiphar
Mhm.
says to like execute him like on the spot, and
Yeah.
then she like says something because she feels bad, like
Oh,
that,
yeah.
because she kind of liked him, you know, she was attracted to him, so she didn't want him killed.
Oh, so
But
she becomes the hero.
well, what she was also like admitting that she kind of like, you know, initiated the whole thing.
Yeah.
But that's
She's
what,
right.
that's
She
what,
must
She's
have
like-
that, I didn't realize.
She's like,
Yeah.
you owe me one.
Yeah,
I saw
I'll be
you
waiting
with
for you when you get out of prison.
I saw you with that maid down by the river.
It's hilarious.
So, and here's just an example, like doing right seems like it backfires. You know, you might be faced with a temptation or a decision, and like you do the right thing and you're like thinking you got victory and you're going to please God and be blessed for it, and then end up in a worse place. Because here Joseph, you know, successfully like possibly resists this temptation or flees, whatever, but then he's cast in prison. I mean, again, like if I'm Joseph, I'd be like, God, like, you know, I'm doing the best I can. I'm following you. I'm doing what's right. Why am I like here now? Like it just gets worse and worse and worse. But yet he continued to trust. And so even when we do right and it doesn't bring physical relief or a better position or, you know, something good in our lives, just stay faithful, keep at it. Because sometimes it's more of a long-term thing. God has our whole lives planned out ahead of us. He knows how he can work out everything from now until the end of our lives. And so even if we get thrown down in a pit, you know, we can't see that God's got something better down the road, or that he's going to use that experience for something good. So take heart and just keep making the best of it. So even while he's in prison, like I said, he ends up running the place. even in a bad situation, as bad as a prison is, he ends up in charge. He's like is in charge of all the prisoners. He's in control of it. So again, just God blessing him, directing his steps, and then coming back to dreams. We know the story. The butler and the baker got thrown in prison, and he ended up interpreting their dreams. And the butler, I don't remember which one. The butler got killed, and the butler was set free, and the baker, I think, was killed.
The baker got killed.
Yeah, the baker was
King
killed.
Like the wine taster dude.
Yeah, the butler that
He
like,
was-
He said.
Yeah, he was
in
freed. He
3
would-
days you will return.
yeah, he'll bring the wine to him, and he told the butler, just remember me when you get out of here. But then it actually says that he forgot about Joseph. Like,
The guy who saved your lips.
well, it's like, I mean, if you're the butler, you don't want to go to Pharaoh and say, hey, you remember that time that like you got really mad at me and threw me in prison? You don't want to remind them of like your failures, so you want to bring it up again. So you probably just, let's put that part of my life behind me. So he interprets their dreams, and he was forgotten for a time. But then Pharaoh has a dream with a bunch of cows and a bunch of corn, and he had 7 huge fat cows, and then 7 lean, skinny cows that ate up the fat cows, and you had big, full ears of corn that were eaten up by the lean, skinny ears of corn. And sure enough, that's when the butler, oh, hey, yeah, you remember there was a time when I displeased you, and I encountered this guy, and they brought Joseph, and he interpreted the dreams, and, it was a prophecy of 7 good years of, like, plentiful, good crops and cattle, followed by 7 years of famine. And because here Joseph was in prison, and he goes from prison, I mean, think about it, prison to vice president, the second most powerful man in the world from a prison cell. I mean, only God can do that. So as hard as it might be, as hard as your situation might be, God can change it in a minute. Tomorrow your life could be completely different. It's all up to God. You just trust him and do the best with what you have and where you're at. And Joseph was about 30 years old at this time, and he was made, the second most powerful man in Egypt to prepare for this famine. So for 7 years, they would collect extra corn and grains and put them in store cities and storehouses to prepare for that famine that was coming. So a little bit about life in Egypt. So sure enough, famine comes along. And without getting too deep into all this, the scene with Joseph and his brothers and how they come to Egypt during the famine, and they're reunited with Joseph. That's a long story short, but there was, he didn't immediately identify himself to them. They didn't recognize him when they got to Egypt. He tested them, and ultimately they passed the test, and then he revealed himself, and he forgave them for the harsh treatment, and he even acknowledged that everything that they meant for evil, God meant for good, and worked it out. So he chose forgiveness over resentment, which is another, just one of so many stories or pictures, applications we can get from this, that, choosing to forgive can be way more prosperous and good for us than resentment. If he would have just rejected his brethren and, you guys sold me, I have nothing to do with you, just get out of here, and they end up dying in the famine, and then where's Israel? Then God's got to start over again. So just being faithful and...
Oh, this is a big black one.
Black spider.
I had 2 thoughts. I thought
Oh, the thing's like,
maybe
what
Joseph
is it?
didn't. The whole.
What's that, Jake? Say again?
I had 2 thoughts. The whole Joseph situation.
Yeah.
When his Potiphar's wife tried to remember you said it was like a couple times where she tried to advance on him.
Yeah.
Do you think
him being like a servant and knowing like the situation he was in, he really had no one to like tell, essentially. I mean, what's he gonna tell? Like, Potiphar, your wife's hitting on me? He'd probably get thrown in prison.
Yeah, it's
Either
definitely,
way.
yeah, it's a real difficult situation.
So, like, when she called him in, you know, what was he gonna say? Potiphar, I need you to come in here with your wife. Your wife is requesting me. Or call in another servant. I mean, what if the servant's like, why don't you go into her, like, and just deal with her? You know, he probably didn't like even want to explain what was going on.
Yeah, you know,
You know.
as thanks. Yeah, when like to look at it in hindsight, you can think about. Yeah, it's easy to think about ways to handle it. Like, okay, well, take another respected servant and have him like stand outside the room without the wife knowing that he's there. So then, if something happens, you've got another witness that can back him up. But I mean, yeah, I mean, but that's
Well,
like that's the,
he probably tried his best to avoid her, but you know, all
Yeah.
day in and day out, it's like
yeah, I know.
at some point.
And like I said, it was over a 10-year period. I mean, I don't know how long that particular trial went on for. You know, she could have been giving him the eyes for years and trying to flirt with him, and you know, and then just all of a sudden out of the blue.
And real quick, my other thought was what you were saying about him making the best situations, like in everything. Like when he was in prison, I'm sure when the butler and the baker came up with these dreams, it probably crossed his mind like, oh, dreams, you know, like, oh, I have those and look where it got me. You know, I told my brothers about those and look where it got me. If he was like not being faithful and just like pouting in prison, he might have just said, I don't even care anymore. Like, interpret your own dreams. You know.
Yeah.
Like, he probably maybe thought, oh, look where it got me to interpret dreams before.
Yeah,
But he
yeah,
didn't.
he could have like kind of just been wallowing in self-pity and be like, yeah, like you said, just, you know, who cares, you know, it's just a dream. But he was like looking for opportunities. And, like right away, it's like, hey, God can give the interpretation of dreams, and he goes and does the best that he can. He's always diligent, always doing the best. You know, just an example for us. So Joseph and his brothers are reunited. And forgiveness, just a good example, testimony of forgiveness, and how it's the right thing and can be a great blessing. And Jacob ends up moving his entire family down to Egypt because Joseph sends for them and says, hey, we got some good land for you, and sends wagons and servants to go and help move the whole family, which it was about 70 people. So when Jacob brings his whole family to Joseph in Egypt and settles in Egypt, it's like there's like 70 people, and that's in Exodus 1:5, and we're about like 1660 BC. So, and they flourish during famine. Forgiveness over resentment, flourishing during famine. So even in the midst of a world famine in that area, following God led them to still be blessed and be provided for. So, as we're looking for, this is maybe a little bit of a side thing, maybe a little political, but only in the sense that I'm looking for types and things in the Bible. So, Egypt, we know, is a type of the world, right? Well, what if it's also like a type of America? Because as I'm reading through this, there's some really interesting similarities that you can see in the progression of a nation. So we have Egypt it's a major world power, like America is. You know, it may have been like the strongest, most powerful nation at that time. And what happens? They declare an emergency and they take your money, right? And isn't that kind of like what happens in America? Like something bad happens. Oh, we've got 9/11. Oh, we have the pandemic. So we're going to start doing things to try to take your freedoms, take your money, take more taxes. Because if they would have just done that for no reason at all, if there hadn't been an emergency, and all of a sudden they want to try to increase taxes for the government, people are going to be like up in arms, like, hey, we can't do that. That's, you know, we got our rights. You can't just take our money. But when there's an emergency, it seems like the government can kind of get away with a lot more than they can during normal peaceful times. So they instituted a tax for that 7 years. They took a fifth of all the crops and all the food and stuff that was grown, and they stored it all, and it all worked out for good. They needed that. It was right. God had led that with giving Joseph wisdom, and it worked out to provide for them during the famine. But it's just, you definitely see that where a government takes advantage of emergencies to start moving their plans forward. So after the taxes, the government took control of the food distribution. So you had, like, during the famine, they're the ones that people are coming to for food. I mean, we see some of that in the government today. They're in control of, the government has huge warehouses full of food, and they hand out food stamps and food to other people that aren't as well off financially and stuff. And we view it as a good thing, but it's still, the government is involved with the food distribution. And during this whole emergency thing, it goes even further. The government takes control of production, where once people ran out of money trying to buy the food that was all stored up in Egypt, they're like, okay, well, bring us your cattle, bring us your horses, bring us your sheep. We'll trade you the corn for your cattle, for your sheep and your horses. And so eventually, the government of Egypt owns the production, because, I mean, it was an agricultural society. That's how you produce things, right? I mean, today we have, car manufacturers and all kinds of production, but back then, I mean, you produced cattle, you produced sheep and horses, and that was like a major form of production. But now the government owns it all; they control it. And then they took control of land. After they ran out of cattle and sheep and horses to trade, they started literally just giving the land that they owned to the government in exchange for food, all during this course of this emergency. And it's kind of like, if you look at America, you see more and more going towards like a socialist type thing, with the government having more and more control, and the government has control of our land. If you look at like the way ancient Israel was set up, the land was divided up and given to the different tribes of Israel. And once they had that land, it could never be taken away. I mean, you owned it forever. Even if you sold the land, you could only have it sold until the year of Jubilee, and then the land went back to the original owner. And you had to take into account, like, if you were selling it and you knew the year of Jubilee was 5 years away, you couldn't ask as much for the land. But it was always belonged to your family. And it used to be that way in the United States. You could go get a plot of land, build a house on it, and just be a lazy bum the rest of your life. You wouldn't lose that land. It was always yours. It was always your family's. But now, the government instituted property tax, which essentially means, like, you can never truly own your land. You can't just live on your land and do nothing. You need to have an income to pay your taxes, or else they'll take your land. You don't truly own it. And similar here, government took control of the land. And then the government can take control of their personal life. Literally told them where they could live. They moved the people from out in the country, moved them into the cities. Well, you can't live out there anymore. You got to live over here. So just like shifting everything around. Just kind of interesting. Like, you can kind of compare this to things that we see going on in the news today. And then ultimately, people become slaves to the government when they ran out of money to buy food, and they ran out of cattle to trade for food, and they already sold their land to the government to get food, and so then they end up literally like selling themselves and like working for the government. Pretty much a pure like socialist society with the government control of everything. And then that temporary emergency tax became permanent tax. Now we see that, where the government, it's emergency, we need to like do like something temporarily, but then when the emergency passes, the emergency measures don't totally go away. They just kind of, people get used to it and like, we'll just keep that then. Then they begin to persecute God's people. We see they're putting the Jews to hard bondage and slavery, and we see that in the world today as it's getting more and more difficult to try to take a stand for righteousness and do right. But what follows soon after is God's judgment. So we can start looking up and getting a little anxious that as we see the downfall of a nation, God's blessings, intervention can be soon to follow. So anyway, just a little aside.
I was just gonna say, I think it seems like everybody is, no matter where or who or what denomination you are, is like taking a step back, especially after COVID and everything. Like a lot of churches have been disbanded. A lot of people haven't come back to church because they just grow lazy, you know. And even just like we're at the fair the other night, and you know how Old Pass always used to have their thing up. Well, last year they didn't have it because it was COVID.
Yeah.
But this year they had it, and it was Old Pass in Greg Pritchard's church in Albion or whatever. But it's like they were just doing little hand paintings,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And I just thought that was interesting. It's like, well, I was like, well, maybe they're actually learning, but also I think it's just they know if they come in there trying to hand out gospel tracts like they used to, and big Jesus save signs and messages and stuff, that's not going to be as well received as it used to be.
Yeah.
Everybody's, you know, it's getting more and more anti-God. So you try bringing that stuff in a fair now, and it's going to be, you're going to start fights, you're going to start, luckily there's no alcohol at this fair, but like still, if there was, it would be definitely.
Yeah, you can see where them saying, like, you know, for you handing stuff out, you're like spreading germs, or, you know, you could be contaminating.
Just with all the pro-transgender and all that, now it's like we're becoming like the hated ones.
More and more of a minority there.
Not that I like agree with, you know, putting up big signs and handing out tracts, but it's just like you can notice them taking a huge step back.
Yeah, right? I mean, at least you were free to do that if that's the way you wanted to express yourself before, but now you're taking much more of a risk, you know, to do that, which sign of the times. So then Joseph, rest in peace. Isaac dies. And we learned about this a long time ago. I mean, Isaac died after he had moved down. Jacob. Wow, I was really busy this week.
We understand.
Jacob died, and he made his family promise: "Don't leave my bones in Egypt. Make sure you know, bring me back to the promised land and bury me there." So he got that promise from them, and then Joseph dies, and as we come to the close of the book of Genesis, which started so promisingly, in the beginning God, ends with the words, "in a coffin in Egypt." Kind of shows the progression that man has done from the time God created to the time we get to the end of the Patriarchs. And to talk a little bit about Joseph, and just again, like, as a type of Christ, there's so many. He's one of the best pictures. There's so many different things that you can find where he's a type of Christ. You've heard of A.W. Pink? He claims that there's 150 parallels between Joseph's life and Christ. So we're going to take some time, and I don't know if I'll get through all 150 tonight, but we'll get through 10. I don't know, just a few. Just, you know how I like to review just a few.
I'm not going to do all of them.
No, I'll be here till midnight. Well, I mean, just like little examples, like Joseph, it's kind of small. The father both sent their sons to like check on their brethren. You know, Jacob sent Joseph to go check and see how his brothers were doing. The Father in heaven sent Jesus to his brethren. They were both, Jesus and Joseph, were beaten and rejected by their own people. Joseph by his own brothers, Jesus by fellow Jews. They were both accused of sin, yet without sin. You know, Joseph was accused of attacking Potiphar's wife, but yet he didn't. He was without sin. And the same with Jesus, accused of sin, yet without sin. Both of them have coats dipped in blood. Jesus, when at his return, will be his coat will be red, as if it was dipped in blood, and Joseph's coat was dipped in the blood of an animal to try to deceive their father that he was killed. There's a picture here. It's interesting, with the butler and the baker, who represent like wine and bread, and the wine is like blood and bread, and the bread was the one that ended up dying, and the blood ended up living I'm not sure how that whole picture works out, but there's something there with like the butler, the baker, the wine and the bread, and obviously Jesus with the wine and the bread. Both of them were, died in a sense, where Jesus was literally, died and put in a cave, and Joseph was put in a pit and then taken out again alive, where Jesus came out of the cave alive. Joseph was a shepherd. Jesus is the good shepherd. Both of them were beloved of the Father. Both of them were hated by their brethren. Both of them sold for the price of a slave. Both of them around 30 years old, Jesus 33, when they stood before a king. Both of them, to their brethren, they knew him not. The scripture says in John that he came to his own, and his own knew him not. And when Joseph's brothers came into Egypt, it says that they knew him not. So they didn't even recognize him. This one's interesting. They both married a Gentile wife. Jesus took the church out of the Gentile nations as a Gentile wife, and Joseph married, was it Zephaniah, whatever the priest of On's daughter, which is like interesting that here you've got this godly man and he marries an idol priest like his daughter. I mean, not sure, that must have been some interesting pillow talk there, but just the comparison there. Jesus and Joseph both married a Gentile wife. They both rule a heathen land. Joseph rules Egypt, the picture of the world, and Jesus is literally going to rule the world. I thought of this one. Joseph's brethren rejected him the first time he came. Being born and growing up there, they ended up rejecting him and throwing him in a pit. But then when they ended up coming back to him later on and receiving forgiveness, it's kind of a picture of Jesus and the Jews. Jesus came to his brethren, the house of Israel. They rejected him and killed him, put him in a pit, essentially a cave. And eventually the Jews are going to repent and come to Jesus. And he's going to do the same thing Joseph did. He's going to forgive them and restore them and bless them when the nation of Israel is restored. When Joseph revealed himself, his brethren were troubled. When he finally exposed who he was in Egypt, it says that they were troubled. They just were what in the world? And when Jesus comes back, people are going to be troubled. So I thought discussion, I was wondering why did God send his people into Egypt? What's the purpose? And like I was talking about earlier, the whole lifestyles of the Jacob's family were pretty scandalous. So I don't know if maybe going into Egypt was a form of punishment for them, ultimately, just because they weren't godly. But maybe it's a picture of the Christian life. We get saved and we grow a little bit and get to know God, but then we can't just stay in our own little bubble, protected and isolated from the world. As Christians, we're called to go out into the world and be a good testimony and a good witness. So maybe the reason that God let the Jews leave Canaan and go into Egypt and stay there, maybe it was because he wanted to use them as an example. Here he called them out. Remember why God called Abraham in the first place, to have a monotheistic religion, belief in one true God, instead of all these pagans and all the idolatry that was going on. They were to be a light in Egypt. Egypt has all kinds of gods. They're very pagan, and all the different idols, they just worship all kinds of things. Maybe it was a test for them that the Jews were to actually have clung to their faith and declared the one God, and possibly have made an impact in Egypt. And unfortunately, as we kind of look back in history, it ends up that the Jews ended up being more corrupted by their time in Egypt than them having an effect and converting Egypt to believing in one true God. So maybe that was part of it. God also had a plan, obviously long term, for that 400 years that they were in Egypt. They multiplied from the 70 people to 2 to 3 million people. So that may have been part of the plan. So, I don't know. Any thoughts? You know, like what I'm saying? Because sometimes you wonder, like, well, why did they go to Egypt in the first place? Because it was way back when Abraham was traveling around and he was in Canaan and there was a famine and he went down into Egypt and then God was like, okay, well, your people are going to be in bondage here for 400 years. Well, how come?
Well, after Joseph died, that's when, like, years and years later,
Yeah, it was like hundreds.
the Israelites or whatever came under, like, slavery, right?
Yeah,
Under
yeah.
a new pharaoh or whatever.
Oh yeah, it would have taken a while.
And maybe God was just using that whole situation to show himself as faithful, you know, by bringing them out, and then you get Moses and
Right, building
all
up
those
for
different
the
pictures, you know.
building up for the big reveal.
Yeah, and it always seems like God uses, like, the bad situation always to a good situation,
Mhm.
like in almost every story. You know, you
Yeah.
see like Joseph, then Moses, then
Yeah, like
You know.
Joseph, Joseph's life got worse and worse and worse, and then boom, you know.
I mean, God specifically chose Israelites to show Himself faithful to,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
Like keeping His promise and all that.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's another way He would do it.
Yeah, I'm sure he had long-term plans. I mean, obviously we can see how it all worked out for good.
Mhm.
I had a thought too. Like you said, Joseph was a picture of Jesus. And your question, why did God send his people in Egypt, was that like post Joseph's rule? Like God sent his people in Egypt after Joseph went into
Well,
Egypt?
they came into Egypt like shortly after he became ruler.
Yeah, so my thought was, as Jesus,
Probably like 7, 8 years, because you had the 7 years preparing for the famine, but then the famine came along after 7 years, and that's when his family got hungry and they sent his brothers down and they
right,
found out who he was, and so it was several years into his leadership in Egypt that they came down.
yeah, Jesus says that he will draw all men unto him. So my thought was, when Joseph went down to Egypt, kind of as a picture of Jesus going into the world, then like now there's no separation of Jews and Gentiles.
Mhm.
So on that timeline, like you said, like following Joseph as Jesus, I was just thinking that it might be, there's something there, maybe,
Yeah, that's interesting because the Jews and Gentiles all came into Egypt for food.
Yeah,
You know,
so
they
like
all
a picture of
came.
Jesus when he came.
That would draw people, knowing where they can get fed, and they would know that Joseph is the man who's in charge of all that and the food distribution. So yeah, people would be drawn to him in that
Yes,
sense.
so now you have Jews and the world mixing in that time frame, just as you had Jews and Gentiles mixing in Jesus' time frame.
Yeah, once the
like
church started, yeah, and
Yeah,
Jews and Gentiles.
that, yeah.
Also, weren't didn't you say like 3 million Jews?
Yeah.
Like after Joseph was gone and stuff? And they
Yeah,
were
when
started like 70?
like during the Exodus, like by the time Moses comes along, there's like 2 to 3 million.
Well, I was thinking that 70 people, those
Yeah.
were probably all of like the brothers,
Yeah, it was the
like
12.
families and kids.
Yeah, it was the
And it's
12.
almost like they're reaping what they've sown
Mhm.
by throwing Joseph in the pit in the first place, and him going to Egypt, and then like they're drawn to Egypt,
Mhm.
and then his families are reaping what they've done basically.
Yeah,
Generational
yeah, it's true.
consequences.
Yeah.
I always thought of it as a negative thing. Like them staying in Egypt was they got too comfortable
Hmm.
in the world. Same with like in the book of Ruth, like Elimelech and Naomi go because of the famine, but then they get comfortable and stay in
Yeah,
Moab instead of going back to Israel where God intended for them to be. So I always thought of it that way as kind of a negative, like
oh,
they
yeah.
went because God was providing for them for the famine, and then they should have gone back, but they got comfortable
Mhm.
in the world and then
Yeah, and
suffered the consequences.
that's a real good point because that goes back to like a while back when we were doing dispensationalism, and during that dispensation of the patriarchs, I didn't bring it up in our discussions here, but God's command was to live in the land of Canaan. He commanded them stay in the land, like this is your land, and they disobeyed and went to Egypt, and because they went and dwelt in Egypt, it was a failure of that dispensation, and that's how things had to move on. But yeah, that's exactly goes along with that. It's good.
I think it's like refining gold through the fire too, burning out all like I think he does that with all of us and in the Bible a lot too. Like Caleb was saying, there's always a bad situation. Not always, but a lot of times a bad situation before there can be a good. You know, like Jesus had to die before we could be. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like almost like that type of thing where maybe if they didn't go into Egypt, it was this long, drawn out process of like, who knows, honestly, anyone's guess.
Yeah.
But going through Egypt and basically getting beat to nothing, you know, getting refined, like to where they could almost maybe speed up the whole process of, because I don't know, God's like master plan is just so.
Yeah, I'm sure, like,
than-
some sort of refinement, trials to help strengthen them, maybe see who would remain true, you know, because there was, you know, they go in representing the one God, but yet they're among all these heathens that have, you know, all kinds of idols and all these other false gods, you know, which ones are going to be true to them. Well, I'll stop it there, but